Hi, Amy. Thank you for joining with us. I just wanted to mention your book before you start your presentation because this book, Hanji Unfurled, this book made me really wanted to meet Amy and also really wanted to hear um, from you about your process and then journey with Hanji and then also the meaning of learning that ancestry, history and um, craft and art. So yeah, I just really feel really grateful that I was able to meet you and also you're with me and then you're gonna share your story. I'm just super excited. Thank you again. And
Welcome.
yeah, yeah. Please start
Thanks,
your
Rosa.
story.
Thanks, Rosa. I feel a little bad because I left out a lot of my backstory because when I give these talks, it's so important for me to get a lot of the details of the paper making across. So I kind of sacrificed my life story for that. But I just wanted you to see in kind of live action some of the processes in making hanji, which is Korean paper. So when you say hanji, that encompasses Korean and paper, because han means Korean and chi means paper. So a lot of people will say hanji paper, and that's incorrect because it's redundant. Hanji is not an adjective, it's a noun that includes its adjective, which is Korean. So I'll either talk about hanji or Korean paper. And there's a very long process that's been handed down for hundreds, if not at least 1,000 years from Korea. And it starts with being very close with plants, essentially, and farmers who could do this kind of work. So even before you get the fibers for paper making, you need to harvest a different kind of plant, and you would cultivate this plant that is technically now Abelmoschus manihope, but it's known to us as hibiscus, and its roots are something you harvest every year because the roots give you this mucilage that will help suspend the fibers in the vat and also slow down the action of the water, the drainage. And so that makes it possible to do this type of sheet formation. The fiber itself for paper making is paper mulberry, Brucinetia papyrifera, and you harvest by hand. You have to steam these shoots that are a year old so that the outer bark pulls away from the inner woody core, and then the outer bark you have to then scrape so that you can get the outer black layer off as well as the green layer, and then you get to the inner white layer, which is what makes the paper, and you can store this dry and bleach it in the sun if you want it to be lighter, and then you cook it in an alkaline solution. And to get that alkaline, you have to also harvest other plants. These are pepper plants, burn them, and then drain hot water through them to get high alkalinity. After you cook, you have to pick all the little bits out by hand that are remaining of the bark, and then you can feed it. And so this is actually using what they call a knife feeder, but traditionally this is eaten by hand with wooden mallets. And then after you have all the pulp ready, you can add it to a vat full of water. And then by hand, you're going to agitate this vat to really mix it well for about half an hour, then add that mucilage and agitate for another half hour. And then you can start making sheets. And so there's a fine bamboo screen called a pal, and you put it on top of the frame and you move it through the water front to back and then side to side, and it's suspended from a crossbar with a rope. And so you can see there's no frame that holds the slurry over the screen, and this is what's really unique about Korean paper, is that the screen just floats on top of a frame with no decal or decal sticks. And then that thin sheet of paper that is on the screen needs to be removed, and then it's stacked on top of more sheets that are wet. And in between every 2 sheets, you have to add a piece of thread so that you can separate the sheets later. And it's not between every sheet, it's every other sheet. And so you can see my hands are going in hot water because the vat is ice cold. Traditionally, you're making hanji in really cold weather in the winter. It's better for the fibers. It's better so that things don't degrade with bacteria. And so this screen goes back onto the frame, and then you're going to go again front to back. And because you're picking up the slurry in the front, there's more slurry in the front than in the back. And so that sheet is just slightly thicker in the front. And so to even that out, Koreans would make a second sheet and then flip the screen and then have it meet the sheet in front. So you can see that I'm flipping the screen 180 degrees and then putting it down. And so that's why they will call it umyangji, or like moon sun paper, the yin yang theory, so that the two, holes complete, so two parts make a whole. And so you're always working with traditional hanji, was working with a double layer. And so that's what makes it really strong. And then after you press out the water, which I don't have video of because it's a very slow, boring process, you have to then separate the sheets and then dry them. And so this is a little bit sped up in terms of technology because we're looking at heated steel plates, but in the past you would you would brush it onto walls or leave it on the floor to dry because Koreans had heated floors. But you can see I pulled away the thread, and that separates that front edge, and then you can put it onto a rod and then pull away the sheet of paper so it doesn't tear. And then you have to basically brush that sheet onto the heated steel plate, and then you have to do it pretty quickly, otherwise the paper starts to dry as soon as it hits the heat. So you want to go really fast. And in this case, I just want you to be aware, everything I'm doing is I'm learning. So this is not like, this isn't way too slow. Like this is a very novice person working. So, there's no way that I would even become a master of making hanji in my lifetime. But so you can see the third sheet went down, steam's coming up, the first sheet's already dry, and then you just keep placing them down. And then once everything is dry, the last step is this hammering technique. And they used to, again, hammer with wooden mallet by hand, but nowadays they have these kind of mechanical arms, and that helps make the paper, it's denser and reduce ink bleed and make the surface shiny, and it's just makes it a lot finer. And so that was also very particular to Korean paper, even though in China and Japan there were some hammering techniques, but it was really well known in Korean paper. So that's the video. I wanted to also go through the different steps, and this is my teacher, Jiseung, and he agreed to teach me after me spending basically 6 months going through the Korean countryside and begging other people and them saying no. And so we went to the train tracks and we just cut down paper mulberry trees. This is actually right now I'm in Korea doing more Fulbright research, and this is near Jiseung, which is in Jeolla province, and it's at Isanok traditional hanji. And so this is in the mountains, and this is a more traditional steaming where they're doing a lot at once. And so they've been steaming this all morning. And then you can see where you might not be able to see in this picture. This is from there. This next picture is from Mungang Hanji, which is kind of further in the center of South Korea. But you can see after you steam, the bark will pull away from the inner woody core. And that's the only time you can actually peel the bark away. And so then you have to do the manual labor of literally peeling all the bark off. And then doing that, you do all that all day, then you have to scrape those outer layers off. This is back at Isanok traditional hanji. And then here is bark that's still waiting to be scraped. This has been scraped, so this is what we call the white bark. This is what was scraped off. So this is kind of the waste bark, but it's not thrown away. You can make kind of a second-rate wrapping paper out of this. And then these are the inner woody cores, and this would you use for firewood. This is not the part that makes the paper. And then this is the storeroom where they would store all of their white bark. And then this is back at Changjibang, when I was studying with my teacher in 2009. And this is when we had to go to a pepper field and essentially just harvest all these dead pepper plants so that they could be burned and then turned into an ash that has a high pH. And then to make the water, the pot ash, or essentially what it's called jemul, you have to send hot water through over and over through the ashes so that the water picks up the alkalinity of these ashes. And then that's what you have to cook the white bark in. So this is the cook, and you do this until the fiber pulls apart easily against the grain, and then you have to rinse the fiber, and then you have to do this. This is the most laborious part, is picking all the little bits of bark that are left in the fiber, and you can only do it by hand. This is not something you can mechanize, and it's always things done by women. So it's like very invisible. Their labor is very invisible in the process. But this is also why Hanji and this kind of paper is so expensive, because you have to pay people to do this step. And then after that, you can beat. And like I was saying earlier, you used to beat by hand, and now they have these machines that you can use to beat the fiber. So this is the hibiscus plant. And you're cultivating that for the roots that you pull up every year. And then when you're ready to use them, you kind of beat the roots so that they start oozing this mucilage, and you soak it in cold water. And then you strain out the roots and all the bits, and you keep the mucilage. And then you can, again, start agitating the vat, and then start making sheets. And this is Shin Hyun-se, and he is probably the best paper maker in Korea, especially when it comes to conservation grade paper. He's the only one who's able to make that type of paper. And he's very far south in Uryongun. And I was very lucky to be able to meet him very early on in my research. But you can see he's now in his mid 70s, and he's still working. And luckily he's training an apprentice. But this is the process of someone who's extremely skilled making hanji. And then this is his hydraulic press that he uses. This is the press at Changjibang. And again, that's just to press out the water. And then, like I was trying to show you, there are threads. You can see sticking out the little black threads that you put down that are really necessary when you dry the paper. And so you pull the thread away so that that top edge can stick to the rod, and then you pull that away and then start drying, and then do the hammering process for tochim. And so while I was making hanji at Changjibang, I had gotten there in the winter, and I would try to warm up in this, what they call a box container, and I would read books. And they had a book that included images of this guy who runs Paper Now in Japan, and he was doing really beautiful dyed papers. And I thought about how important color is to, not just to paper, but to human beings, and how human beings are always seeking out color, kind of almost unconsciously. And so I felt like it was so great that I learned to make paper, but I wanted to also learn to create color. And so I found a natural dyeing teacher in Seoul, and this is Lee Myung-sun, and he works with his wife. And this is at their old space in Seoul. They've since moved. And the first lesson was onion skins, using onion skins to make dye. And it was a really different approach. It was, and he would let me bring paper to dye so that I could just experiment. So these, I think, are really important to show you. These are like totally failed. Like, this is how I learned. I did not learn in any traditional way. I just learned by dunking paper into hot dye baths and being like, oh, that will eat up the paper. And so you can see what happens, especially this probably actually isn't even onion skin, because there are so many yellow and brown natural dyes that we went through. But this is somok, and so it's related. It's sapin wood. It's related to Brazil wood, and it's the heartwood of the tree, and it gives you this beautiful red on silk. But then, so these are silks that are dyed with that. But then this is when I experimented with a whole lot of different pieces of hanji that I made at Changjibang, and you can see the color takes differently for every single sheet of paper, because we were doing different batches. So some I harvested trees by hand. Some of them were recycled papers. Some of them were, so you can see that depending on the paper, even with the same dye bath, you'll get different colors. You can also see where I was kind of very vigorously squeezing the wads, and then it was really hard to get them open again. And so this is not the way you would want to dye hanji, but again, this is how I learned. I mean, it's essentially just through experimentation. And so I would just do a lot of, I had already learned the joomchi process, which is a way of texturing hanji, so I didn't mind all the wrinkles. I also, before that, in my artwork, was knitting a lot of paper out of yarn that I would make out of paper. And so he would let me bring things like that to dye as well. And then this is his wife with safflower petals. And this is how it would come out on fabric. pomegranate fabric, and then cloves, turmeric root. Again, you can see kind of all that, the different versions of beat up hanji that went through the different dye vats, cassia seeds for yellow, and you can see the silk is in the back and then the hanji is in the front, and you can tell, like when I was doing this process, it was all just very wrinkled, but you can also tell to an extent how strong this hanji was, because I was able to put it in the hot dye baths, and it's still, there are still pieces that actually survive. This is after doing an indigo dye bath, as well as the green comes from over dyeing over yellow dyes. And sometimes I would just, you can kind of see, I would like roll up the hanji and dye it because it was kind of stronger as a whole, and then open it up later. And then in the foreground, you're seeing the silk. So that's the color that would come out on silk. And then this picture, you can just see essentially, it's just a whole variety of silk as well as hanji. And you can kind of tell the pieces that are wrinkled are all hanji, and then the pieces that are kind of more smooth are silk. And the reason I liked being here is because it was a really good juxtaposition to the work I was doing, not only at the hanji mill, but also when I was learning how to weave paper using Jiseung. And so this teacher would let me bring friends who were visiting from overseas. And so it was this very open experience of just like anyone can come and do natural dyeing. And maybe it's not like extremely specific or extremely traditional, but it was just a very open and friendly gateway to doing this kind of work. And that was kind of exactly what I needed at the time. And you can kind of see here now the paper threads and the cords I was using to dye, and then experimenting with making pieces that were already made and then dipping the whole thing, or dyeing the paper and then making the cords, or making the cords and dipping them and then making pieces. And so these are sample books that I was making to try to show the different dyes that I was learning there. And then I would apply that, like, when I came back to the States, I helped, I essentially built the first hanji studio in North America, and then expanded that. And part of that was adding a dye garden. And so these are marigolds. And so this is a book I did actually this past summer, and this was at Oak Spring Garden Foundation. And so because I already had experience of using marigold blossoms, I was able to do that in Virginia at this residency. But the juxtaposition was with another craft that I was learning, which was weaving paper like baskets. And so I learned this from Na Hwan, and this was when he was still in Seoul and his first wife was still alive. And I would go there every week and spend like 2 to 4 to 8 hours with him, because he was so particular about how to do everything. And so he's the only person that I know of in Korea who does Jiseung in this way, and which means he makes these ropes, essentially cords out of hanji. So you take 2 pieces of hanji and then you have to cord them together. And everyone else essentially uses a more traditional, like an older way, where you take 1 strip at a time and you'll twist it by hand all the way down. And that's kind of the most classical way of doing Jiseung, which is also called noyeokye. But I learned this way. And so this is what I would do. He would have me do things like make hundreds and hundreds of cords in a week, which was really rigorous. And that's why I really appreciated having kind of that against the natural dyeing. But so after you make the cords, you can then start essentially twining. So twining is one of the oldest forms of basketry, and you see it in any basketry tradition in the world. You'll see twining is one of them. And this is, we're working on a chamber pot, and this is the second layer as it's coming down. And this is the top of the lid and the little handle. And so these pieces are all done 100% out of paper and then used, they're waterproofed. And so this is the process of turning the cords in another direction so you can kind of shape it so that it'll start moving in another direction to figure out the lip of the lid, and then turning it again so that you can kind of finish the bottom of the lid. And so there are all these techniques that I learned, and you always have to then finish your work. So this is sticky rice paste, and that's the first layer of waterproofing. And then after you do that waterproofing, then you can do the second or subsequent layers of lacquer. And so this is what comes from the lacquer tree. So this is also a natural substance that comes from plants. And you have to apply it in many, many layers. And it has to set in very hot and humid climates, because it's not an evaporation process, it's a polymerization process. And so this is the final piece. And so I was learning this process and then trying to figure out how to combine the hanji that I made, and then also natural dyeing, and then this Jiseung process. And so you can see these are all dyed at my dyeing teacher's studio, and then the lacquer, the dark object in the front, is lacquered, so that's completely waterproof and food safe. And then I was also experimenting with, before I started even making paper, I was a book artist and I was really interested in artist books. So I was trying to figure out how I could make a book completely out of paper. And so these are woven covers, and then the inside of the book is all dyed paper, and then it's bound together with more paper cord. And then this is another version of a knitted book that I did. And you can see kind of all the variations in the colors because of the way that I essentially dried it, because the dye color will always rise to that kind of highest point. And so this was also recycled from a piece of clothing I had made from this paper yarn. And I wanted to note how hard it is to actually dye very traditionally, which is not what I do. To dye hanji traditionally, you actually don't want to have all these like variations in color. You don't want your paper to be all wrinkled. And it's extremely difficult to do. And that tradition is pretty much died out in this country. And there's one person, Dr. Cho Hyun-jin, and he's in Jinju, and he has figured out ways of doing this really even application of natural dyes, especially with indigo. But you'll see with my work that it's all very kind of modeled, and that's intentional, as well as that's just my skill level, which is, if you think about it, very low, but it works for the work that I'm doing. So this is a sample of the Jiseung objects that I made before and then after I dyed. So this would be using walnut, indigo, and persimmon. And then this is actually not natural dye, but I just wanted to show you kind of the contrast between the uncolored ones and then the ones that, this one I actually did traditional kind of Turkish marbling with acrylic paints. And then this is another one where this is the piece right after it's been woven, but then right after it's been coated in persimmon juice. And so that's technically not a dye, it's a coating, but it's kind of in that family of natural substances that we get from plants to impart color and durability. And then also traditionally in paper making, you can dye the pulp first and make the paper, but you end up with very kind of more faded colors. And so that's why it's always better, if you want a really strong color, you dye the pulp, make the paper, and then dye the paper again, brush or dip dye. And so I don't have pictures of the paper that we made from this, but it's very light, the colors. These are dye baths of actual flowers that we were doing. And then these are the tests that we had of the dyes. So you can see this is actually on sized paper, and sizing is added to papers to kind of essentially repel water. And so what we've learned is that sized paper takes natural dye much better than unsized paper. You can see how the dye just bleeds. Same with here, it bleeds in a different way, but and then I was making these hanji ducks, and they were essentially to honor the tradition of Korean wedding ducks, where when people get married, you usually give the couple a pair of carved wooden ducks that are painted to look like mandarin ducks, because mandarins are a species that are known to mate for life and also have a lot of babies. And so you give that to a couple, and I'd seen an image of an old one woven out of paper that I was just found really compelling. So I wanted to make them not so much about marriage, but just to test my kind of technical skills, and then also be able to connect to this heritage that So I was born in New York to Korean immigrant parents, and it was kind of a very classic American upbringing where I really rejected the Korean part of myself until I luckily when I was 20 realized that it was something that I wanted to kind of reclaim. And so I went back to Korea to learn the language, relearn the language, because it was my first language, but I had really pushed it away. And so because I was able to then speak with my parents in Korean, after that, I had 10 years of practice before I got a Fulbright grant the first time when I was 30 years old to go. And this was a way essentially for me to connect with being Korean American and having a connection to Korea through my artwork and through paper rather than just having it forced upon me by family. So that's how I approach these ducks as well. It's like this connection that that I have with all the people who came before me, who made paper, who wove paper, who dyed paper, who made objects that were functional, whether for actual use, like whether you'd eat out of it or drink out of it, or out of a ritual use. This is like ritual use is something that I think we don't think about a lot in the US because we've lost so many rituals. And so, things like marking when a child is born or survives childhood or graduates school or gets married or, gets a job or all these things, there are reasons that we mark these times. And so this is the first duck that I made, and I know it looks not like a duck, but I coated it in persimmon dye, but you can tell I used all the same paper for this because then the second one I made, you can see even when I did the dye, it takes in different ways because I was using different cords from different batches. And so that's how sensitive these dyes are. And then this is just to show you the process. So of course here, this was at Haystack, and that's why the setting is like that. It's in Maine. And so I made the duck. I dyed it first with walnut and then thought about dunking in indigo partway and then just went all whole hog on it. So that was the kind of the final version. And that's often the way I work, is very intuitive. Here's the second one that I started. And this is actually with Hanji cords that were already dyed with persimmon. And then so that means that I'm designing essentially the color blocking as I'm going rather than after the fact. And so there are a lot of different approaches. And then these are just kind of homemade dye baths. This one, I can't remember if it's Brazil wood or cochineal, but this is when I was working on an installation and I wanted to do all natural dyes for these cords. And so this is ground cochineal, and then over dyeing on other cords that had been dyed with indigo, and then onion skins. These are red onion skins, and that's where you get that green color. And then these are from yellow onion skins, so you get more of a yellow orange color. And then just all the spent dye stuff. So onion skins, but also that middle bag is of Brazil wood shavings that someone gave me from a friend she had who carves, because it's actually a very endangered plant. So it's very hard to get a hold of that. And so these are the different colors that I got from dyeing over a period of maybe a month or two, trying to come up with all natural dyes for an installation in Columbus. And so these are the dahlia flowers that we used in Cleveland. And then we would freeze them. So you kind of deadhead them. So after the bloom just kind of wilts, you pull it off the plant and it'll grow another flower, and you just put them in the freezer. And once you have enough, you can start to make a bath. And so these are ducks that the blue is from indigo, but the orange comes from that dahlia. And then this is before I was willing to mordant with alum. So this one is using, the pink comes from the purple or red onion skins, but it's not mordanted. So this will fade over time, but the actual color you'd get if you actually properly mordant would be more like this green. So would be using the same materials for dye, but you're using a mordant so that it's slightly more light fast. And the mottled color comes because I dye the cords. And so when you unwind the cords, there's space in between that's lighter. And that's where you get variations in color. And that to me is more interesting sometimes than everything being evenly dyed. Again, it's also because of my skill set. So, and then the beaks are all Brazil wood dye, and that's what's being used on the body of this one. And then the beak on this is probably an onion skin. So, and then this is kind of a mix of all of those techniques where like the beak was the paper, the cords were dyed, the head, the cords were dyed, but then the body is a mix of, you can kind of see as you get closer to the tail, there's like a mix of indigo dye, and then the bottom of the body was all then just dunked completely in persimmon dye. So those are just kind of some of the, just a very cursory view of some of the work that I've done, and hopefully that relates to the project that you're doing, and thanks for inviting me to be part of it.